when you think you have a hot season, when you have a hot player who doesn't win the MVP that should have won the MVP, and you got some hot-headed fans, you think yourself you're pretty good, and when you fall in the playoffs unexpectedly, you'd be like a wasted season almost every time this happens in the big four leagues. For football, obviously, the number one option is the New England Patriots. For 16 and 0 in the regular season, two playoff wins, and then they had a chance to go 19 and 0 and do what people thought was impossible. Heck, getting 14 wins out of 16 is sometimes impossible. Of course, we all know that we're going 17 games, but whatever. The fact of the matter is that the Patriots were hot and then they cooled off in the Super Bowl against the Giants. I can never watch Super Bowl 42 in its entirety. I can never. And then in basketball, you have Golden State with their 73 win season in 2016. Got to the finals. We're up 3 games to 1. All they needed was one win over Cleveland. They wasted the opportunity. Klay Thompson getting himself suspended for game 5. And of course, LeBron's block / Kyrie's 3-pointer in game 7 didn't help matters. In hockey, it's almost every time the Leafs, like the division title for me. Watching the Leafs win the division title, they're first in a full season in 25 years, and all of a sudden they couldn't beat Florida in game 7 on home, no less. But I'm talking about how things are. And also, I'm talking about, well, baseball. It's like almost a good season for the Blue Jays. 2015, the Blue Jays were 1 game below 500 at one point in June, and somehow they put up numbers. They won the division. They should have taken care of Kansas City in the ALCS, but it's failed. So anyway, let's talk about the St. Louis Blues. I know they're a contentious team, but you know what? We're talking about them and the 1981 season in which their star goalie actually should have been league MVP, but he wasn't. Hello out there, we're on the air. It's Cutter with NHL time. Tensions blow, the whistle blown, and the pucks go down the ice. Some teams just want to win the cup and do it with a smile. Hey, that is cool. Up on the River Nile. Oh, the good old hockey game. Who will come out on top? Will a team get through the cup by any means necessary? Oh, the good old hockey game. It's the best game you can name, and I'm have no shame. I will simulate those hockey games. Woo! So the St. Louis Blues were one of the teams in the Great Expansion. That's the thing that had the 6 teams from each um, thing. The 6-team West Division was built for the 67-68 season. All 6 expansion teams would play in that division, and of course, the original 6 teams would play in the East. St. Louis got in alongside California, well, / Oakland, if you will, Los Angeles, Philly, Pittsburgh, and Minnesota. Now, the problem was St. Louis didn't actually have a formal application to the NHL for the Great Expansion, which they were supposed to. Baltimore and Buffalo and Vancouver, by contrast, did, and they got bit. St. Louis pretty much got their team mostly because of a deal with the Solomon family and the Wirtz family, because the Wirtz partially owned the dilapidated St. Louis arena and they needed a tenant. So the NHL said, we'll put a team in the Midwest, St. Louis, even though they didn't formally ask for one. A lot of teams were pissed off. Rightfully so. St. Louis would do well. They built their team around veterans such as Glenn Hall and Dickie Moore. And they did it. The Blues were the best team in the West, in the playoffs, that was, when Ron Schock scored in double overtime to take care of the North Stars and move the Blues to the Stanley Cup Finals against the Canadiens. Unfortunately for St. Louis, they lost in 4 straight. But unlike most sweeps, every game was actually a close one. So it's just amazing what could happen in all that. That the St. Louis Blues lost all the games to Montreal, but they only lost by 1 goal each, and Glenn Hall was given the 1968 Conn Smythe Trophy for Players MVP. St. Louis went back in 1969, also lost to Montreal in 4 straight. In 1970, they went through the Western playoffs and did it again, but this time it would be Boston That's right. Boston, who would take about 4 straight. That's the series where Bobby Orr scored his flying goal after Noel Picard tripped him, in a sense. So the Blues went to 3 finals and couldn't win a playoff finals game. The NHL decided to make things interesting in 1971 and move the Blackhawks to the West Division and make the playoff format that we could have 2 established teams face each other in the final and not have an expansion team, quote unquote, embarrass themselves. So what ends up happening is that, the Blackhawks were faced the Habs. They were original 6, but the Blackhawks went in the West. This is the rare time I've had to wet my whistle. But the fact of the matter was that the Blues were okay. In the 70s, they had troubles. They had financial troubles. By 1983, the Blues were almost on their way to Saskatchewan, while Bill Hunter, one of the heads of the WHA, if you will, actually had plans in place to buy the Blues from Ralston Purina. Yes, the dog food people had owned the Blues for a while, and the arena was called the Checker Dome, and they would decorate the outside of the arena in checkerboards like Ralston Purina. Saskatchewan could have had it, but I don't think Bill Hunter would have promised a 15,000 seat arena like the NHL wanted it. The NHL held their breath. 1983, the Blues could not take place in the entry draft, which actually ruined them in a sense. But thankfully, though, they found owners. Can't remember the owner's name. The guy in 1983. Oh, Harry Ornest bought the team and kept them in St. Louis. St. Louis started earning their debts, and then in 1986, they played Calgary in one of the best conference finals of all time. And all of a sudden, the Blues won Game 6 against Calgary with what they call the Monday Night Miracle, the NHL version, that is. Down 5-2, they looked like they were going to lose, and Calgary was going to go to the Stanley Cup. But somehow they pulled it off in overtime. Doug Wickenheiser, who should not have been drafted by the Habs #1 overall in 1980 in the first place, they should have had Dennis Savard, was the hero. They went back to Calgary for Game 7, but the Blues lost. But the Blues did quite well, getting to the conference finals and all that. The Blues would build big. Cujo in the net alongside Patrick Blonsky and Vince Briando. Brad Hall was a Blue thanks to a trade with Calgary for the one of trading Steve Bozak. Rick Walmsley was also in that trade. Scott Stevens made 1 year appearance in St. Louis. Al McGinnis would come to St. Louis later in the 90s. The Blues were decent and all that. In 93, they shocked the Blackhawks in the first round of the playoffs. And, you know, they felt the shock too in 91 when those pesky Minnesota North Stars took them out in the division finals. But they took out Chicago in the division semis, took on Toronto, went to a Game 7, but unfortunately got blown out 6-0. But they were riding high. Brett Hall looked pretty good when he wasn't so egotistical. And the Blues looked good. Unfortunately, Hall went to free agency, went to Dallas, and he burned the Blues a couple times in the playoffs. In 1999, the Blues were down 3-1 to the Coyotes, of all teams, in the first round, but came back to win thanks to Ricard Persons, what was supposed to be Ricard Persons' overtime goal, but it was tipped by Pierre Turgeon. And the Blues won that series in 7. The Blues would be the best team for the 2000 season in the West, and it looked good for them, but they ran into the San Jose Sharks and they ran into a buzzsaw. Roman Turek just couldn't handle it in the nets, and he went to Calgary soon after. So what ends up happening is that the Blues in the 2000s weren't completely memorable. They did get to the conference finals in 2001 against the Avalanche, but lost in Game 5 thanks to Joe Zak's overtime goal. The Blues would be okay in a sense. They made the playoff. They had a 25-year streak of making the playoffs. People forget about that. But the fact of the matter is that the Blues just didn't have that one signature moment. However, in 2019, they had a season for the ages, as they were last place by New Year's Day. And they fired their coach. They hired Craig Berube, who's now the Leafs coach, but Berube was pretty good. And Jordan Binghamton came out of effing nowhere. The former Owen Sound goalie helped St. Louis make it. And they shocked a lot of teams to get to the Stanley Cup Finals against their old friends Boston. People thought St. Louis was in for their 4th finals loss, and that would set the record for most finals appearances without a title. Unfortunately, though, St. Louis did not stick to the script and won Game 7 in Boston and won the Stanley Cup on Boston ice. I mean, for that girl, what was her name? Leah Anderson or some name, all that, the chemo girl, as they called her. That was a heartwarming moment and all that. But imagine if St. Louis went 0-4 in the finals. They would be the team most snake bit in the finals in history, and Vancouver would not have that mark because Vancouver's the only team who's 0-3 or worse in the Stanley Cup finals. The Blues had some good years, and in 2025 they tried to take out Winnipeg, but got taken out in double overtime by Adam Lowry. So anyway, let's talk about the 1981 Blues. Pretty much one of the best seasons without a title. All right, so the 1981 Blues was the 14th season for the Blues in St. Louis. They won their division for the first time in 4 seasons, winning 45, losing 18, tied 17. 107, which was second place overall in the NHL. The first time the Blues hit the century mark. They won the division by a landslide, almost 30 points. Chicago was the second best team in the Smythe. Then Vancouver, then Edmonton. Now, what to note about the playoffs is that, well, yeah, 4 teams moved on, and we all know about the division format in the 1980s. First versus fourth, second against third in the division. However, let's not forget that this was actually false because the 1981 playoffs actually had a reseed, had the 1-16 system. As you can see here, this was the last Stanley Cup playoffs conducted under a format that paired teams in each round without regard to division or conference standing. So they were 1-16 regardless of division and all that. It actually worked out quite well. The 4 division champs were in the top 5. So they would reseed instead of a fixed bracket system. So they would reseed after each round, of course. For St. Louis, they were the number 2 team. They took on the number 15 team, Pittsburgh Penguins. And then you see them against the Rangers and all that. So anyway, yeah, that's what happened. So yeah, under the format from 1982 onwards, St. Louis would have faced Edmonton in the first round. Chicago and Vancouver would have met. But yeah, St. Louis were the second best team, 107 behind those pesky New York Islanders who had 110. Yeah, the Leafs beat Washington for the last spot in 1981. In the playoffs, they would take on the Pittsburgh Penguins, who were struggling and all that financially and all that. They almost got relocated like twice, I think. Anyway, St. Louis won game 1, lost game 2 at the Checker Dome, then went to the Civic Arena, won game 3, ended up losing game 4 badly 6-3. And then in game 5, it was a battle. As Paul Gardner, George Ferguson, and Greg Malone scored for Pitt. St. Louis got Bernie Federico, Brian Sutter, and Rick LaPointe. In double overtime, Mike Crombie had a rebound and beat Greg Millen, the late Greg Millen, that is. So anyhow, the St. Louis Blues would win in double overtime. It was shocking because Pittsburgh almost upset St. Louis and moved on and took out the number 2 team in the NHL. They would have taken on the Islanders because the Islanders won their series and Pittsburgh were the worst team available. Then in the quarterfinals against the New York Rangers, who everyone thought, oh well, St. Louis is going to win. They split the first 2 games at the Checker Dome, and then they end up losing games 3 and 4 at MSG, and then they won game 5 to stay alive. But the Rangers crushed them 7-4 in game 6, upsetting them and having a great battle with those pesky New York Islanders, their internal rivals. Bernie Federico put up 104 points, which was good. Wayne Babbage, 96. Mike LIUT, 33, 14, and 13 in 61 games played. He was good. Ed Stanikowski was pretty good as a backup. In the playoffs, Federico and Tony Curry will lead the team, and LIUT will play every minute. Not a lot of moves for St. Louis. Rick Wilson went 12 overall to St. Louis. Jim Pafisi, Kitchener. That's right, he was a Kitchener Ranger who went to the St. Louis Blues. Bob Brook, who went on to the Islanders and won a few cups with them, was drafted by St. Louis. And Alain Lemieux, who was Mario's older brother. Yep, Mario's older brother was drafted by St. Louis. Didn't do too much in the NHL. He did play in the NHL, but he didn't. So anyway, what would happen if the Blues did not lose in the quarterfinals? Let's find out. So the St. Louis Blues would have played the Calgary Flames because of reseeding. The Islanders were the top team. St. Louis would have been number 2. Calgary was, I can't remember the real seed, but Calgary would have dropped to number 3 and Minnesota would have been number 4. Because under the fact that the Rangers beat the Islanders, the Rangers were the worst remaining team left by points. So they faced the Islanders. Calgary and Minnesota would meet in the other conference in the NHL semifinals. So that means Calgary would slide down to play St. Louis. And I think Dan Bouchard was the star goalie for the 1981 Flames in the playoffs. I'll have to take a look. After research, I found out that the Flames had Pat Riggin and had him in the net. Kenny Holt. Yeah, I don't know much about the teams and all that. Bill Stewart. I think it was Jerry Hart. Yeah, well, I don't know much about the teams from 1981, and it was weird because Calgary. This was the first year that the Flames had moved from Atlanta, who they never won a playoff series in Atlanta, and then in Calgary they went all the way to the semifinals. So anyway, game one in St. Louis at the Checker Dome would see the Blues lose 7-6. Prepare for many goals because the 80s. Calgary goals in the first period by Bob McMillan, pair of them, and Willie Plett. Blues got Tony Curry and Brian Sutter, part of the Sutter brothers. Guy Chouinard made it 4-2 Flames. Babbage made it 4-3 after another Chouinard goal. LIUT was replaced by Stankowski. I know I'm mispronouncing things, but no, it's not on purpose. Brian Sutter made it 5-4. Don Fat Lever made it 6-4 for the Flames. Blair Chapman made it 6-5. Blake Dunlap tied it, but then Lever again scored to make it 7-6. Pekka Kalile, 17 seconds. Jack Brownshire and Joe Micheletti, not many minutes. McMillan, Lever, and Chouinard are your 3 stars. So, on to game 2. And in the end, it would be the Flames winning 7-5. Kent Nielsen scored the only goal in the first period. And then lots of goals. Flames in the second period. Kent Nielsen for the hat trick, and Bob Murdoch made it 5-0. Leo would have to be replaced again. Mike Zook made it 5-1. Wayne Bouch 5-2. Flames got a goal by Pekka Ruticalio. Joachim Pedersen made it 6-3. Flames made it 7-3 thanks to Nielsen. Babbage and Sutter scoring for St. Louis by 2-0. Pekka played 5 minutes, but he did get a goal. Patty Lovely. Mike Crombie only played 7 seconds. Yeah, he was a second liner. Nielsen, Babbage, and Jorgen. So once again, Leo just couldn't believe it. At 2-0 for Calgary. The Flames went home and won 8-5. So the Blues are up against it. St. Louis trying their best in 1981 to be the finalists that they should be. But Calgary's making it harder on them. Blues were up 3-2 in the first period. Goals by Jerry Hart, Wayne Babbage, and Wayne Babbage. Bob McMillan and Guy Chouinard made it 3-2. Kent Nielsen made it 3-3. Mike Zook made it 4-3 Blues. Willie Plett tied it. Kent Nielsen made it 5-4. A few penalties later, Kent Nielsen gets the hat trick, and Mike Lou again gets replaced. Chouinard made it 7-4, and then he scored his hat trick. Wayne Babbage scored a hat trick for the Blues in a losing effort. Kent Nielsen, Wayne Babbage, and Guy Chouinard are your stars. So Mike Liu isn't the goalie who they thought they were. St. Louis is like, we'll ride Liu into game 4. And they did. St. Louis wins 6-5 to force at least a game 5. Brian Sutter and Wayne Babbage scored. Labratton made it 2-1. But then the Blues went on a tear. Blair Chapman, Jorgen Pedersen, and Bernie Federko made it 5-1 with Pat Riggin having to replace. Kent Nielsen, Bob McMillan, and Willie Plett scoring for the Flames. Wayne Babbage made it 6-4. Willie Plett made it 6-5 for the Flames, but to no avail. Leo finally plays a game in which he's not replaced. Dan Bouchard comes in and does quite well. Babbage, Plett, and Pat Anderson are your 3 stars at the corral. So they go back to St. Louis for game 5. And the Blues would lose. Blues clues, well, they lose in 5 to Calgary. So Calgary would have went on to the finals and probably got there by 10 by the Islanders. Willie Platt scored for the Flames. Blake Dunlap and Brian Sutter in the first period 2-1 Blues, and then Verdugo made it 3-1. But unfortunately, they fumbled. Willie Platt and Don Lever scored, and then Willie Platt's hat trick in overtime sunk the Blues. And Calgary in their first season would have went to the Stanley Cup Finals. Well, first year in Calgary. Mike Crummy played 4 fucking seconds. Come on. Platt, Dunlop, and Sutter, your 3 stars, and Calgary would have sent St. Louis packing in the semifinals. So I guess things just aren't what they used to be. Anyway, I'm Jeff. I'm gonna do.